Welcome back to the archives for the fourth and final round of the October Skirmish. In this round, I was facing Sam Baskarraj, a local Alabama player who had faced a couple times before and have a draw and a loss against. So drew from a winning position. Next game, blundered in the opening. So I was looking for a little bit of revenge against this young up-and-coming player. And they threw out quite the surprise with 1b3, a move that I've not seen them play before, and so I was caught off guard, and it's a move I really haven't faced over the board. So my goal was to get a reasonable position out of the opening, solid, just don't blunder anything. I wasn't expecting to be able to get out of the opening without giving white some kind of advantage, just because they may be more familiar with these positions. So I played d5, and we end up in this structure here, where white has delayed playing d4 up to this point. d4 can block their bishop in a lot of cases if they're not able to open up the center. I played bishop f5. Normally, bishop f5 is a move you want to be careful about because of the weak d5 and b7 points in black's position. Usually white will try to exploit that after a bishop f5 move with the move queen b3. Since queen b3 is impossible, bishop f5 is much safer than normal. They played f4, e6, and this is a pretty normal position right here. We've got some tension that we're both leaving here between the pawns. I can't really attack the dark squares that easily at this point. So they played f4 to try and control the e5 square. In the long run, I'd like to get a knight to help attack these dark squares. Maybe bishop c5 or maybe pawn c5 and put a pawn on d4. So a lot of interesting options here. And then my opponent played the move d4. And this move is just not a good move in this type of structure. They spent extra time to get their bishop to the b2 square, and now they've blocked it in. And with such a solid pawn structure in the center, the d4 pawn really doesn't have any chances to leave d4. So it's going to be very hard to open that bishop up. Now, tactically, this also isn't a good move here, but just in this general position, when you've got that pawn on b2, you want to be careful with a pawn on d4 if you're not going to have a position where you can get that pawn to leave the diagonal to open up the bishop later on. But here, bishop b4 check is just very strong, and white's best option is to play bishop c3. And black would be happy to trade off the bishop that they made so strong. Although if they play bishop c3, I wasn't convinced at the time that I would even take the bishop. I was considering just backing up and saying c3 is where the knight wants to be. Maybe we don't even take it. But they blocked with the knight. And blocking with the knight is a blunder. So playing d4, not a great move because of bishop b4. But blocking with the knight, definitely a blunder. So take a moment here. See if you can find the way that black can win material at this point in the position. All right, this is a tactic that many of you have probably seen when you're doing tactics on chess.com or Lead Chess or in Tactics book. It's a very common tactic, but this is a real game experience. So the move we're looking for is knight to e4. Attacking this pin piece again, but also opening up the queen to go over and attack those dark squares. And in this position, there's really not any way for white to deal with this. If they play a move like bishop to e2, then we're going to be able to trade off some pieces on d2 first. So imagine bishop e2, we go ahead and capture, knight captures, and then we have the same tactic that happens in the game, which hopefully some of you saw. Bishop captures, knight captures, queen h4 check. Boom, attacking the dark squares. Anytime your opponent moves that f-pawn, you want to be thinking about how you're going to attack on the dark squares. And in this position, we weren't able to get our bishop to c5, but we were able to get the knight to e4, attacking the dark squares. And then, by moving that knight out of the way, the queen was able to join the fight on the dark squares. So the only way for them to really get out of this is to play g3 to block the check, so the king doesn't have to move. And now the follow-up is to capture the pawn. White cannot recapture because the pawn is pinned to the rook. And then we would just be up a lot of material. And usually, if you were doing this tactic online, either white would recapture, you would take the rook and the puzzle would end, or the puzzle would just end here. But real game, which means real resistance from the opponent. And so they play the move knight to f3, and black is faced with the decision of what to do with the queen. We don't have time to take the rook yet, so what would we do with the queen? Lots of options. The key here is that as long as we stay on the h-file, we still are pinning the pawn to the rook. This attack versus the king is secondary, so something like knight takes rook check would fail to knight captures queen. So we just back the queen up. Queen to h5 also fine. I just like the idea of defending the g-pawn because white, as I expected, put their rook on the g-file. And we go ahead and take the bishop. And we have this position here where black is up a pawn and the better position. And in these positions where you've won some material but the game's not over, it's important not to trade too much. And so what I was thinking about in this position is how do I use my remaining pieces to increase my advantage? I don't want to try and trade off queens or anything like that. My advantage is not just the extra pawn, but it's the fact that their king is more exposed and can't castle. And we still have weak dark squares, and we have weak light squares. So we go ahead and bring our knight over, looking to hop into these squares that our other knight just occupied with success. My opponent develops their queen, and we go ahead and pin the knight. So not pinning just to trade, but pinning with the idea of how do I use my pieces to increase my material lead. And my opponent played the move bishop to c1. So take a moment here. Feel free to pause the video. What move would you play to win material? And go from just being a pawn up to being up a decisive amount of material. And the move we're looking for is queen to h3 with a fork on the king and the knight. Not a lot that white could do to defend that. Then we jump in with our knight to kick that king away from defending. And we get this trade here. And now their king is still on f1 just like it was. So I'm trying to minimize counterplay. That's part of the reason the bishop went here. Their only play was down the g-file. And now they have to give up the exchange. And we're able to trade off everything. And we reach this position where we are up a full rook and a pawn. So I'll just play the last few moves of the game. Not super exciting or meaningful. Just again, shutting down their counterplay and activating our extra material. And in this position, white resigned. So a nice clean game to finish off the tournament. I finished at 3 out of 4, so came in second place, won a little prize money, and gained 43 rating points. So definitely a successful tournament overall, and a nice start to a whole series of weekend tournaments. So I will be playing this player again. In fact, I did play this player again in the very next tournament. So I'll be posting that recap soon, and you'll see if they're able to take revenge after this game. Thanks for watching. Good luck in your studies and your games. And I'll see you guys in the next recap.